Christina Truong is a web developer and educator from Canada with over 10 years of experience as a front-end developer. As an educator, she's taught over 1,000 students in college courses, boot camps, and workshops. She was the director of curriculum development for Ladies Learning Code, creating workshops for over 20 Canadian chapters. She currently works independently, focusing on inclusive tech education and consulting services. She's also authored what is one of our biggest technology courses at LinkedIn Learning, CSS Essential Training. How's it going, Christina?
Good. How are you doing?
Tell me a little bit about what led you to where you are today.
I kind of fell into it by accident because I was actually in my last year of university and I was studying psychology and communication, so something completely different. Mm-hmm. And one of my professors, she was just trying to teach us new media and stuff. So we just made a basic website just for hosting like links to our homework and stuff. And I just thought it was really fun, but I didn't really think much of it. And then after I graduated, I just didn't really know what I could do with that degree. And I was sort of bouncing around. I ended up getting a temp job as an admin assistant. And one of my big duties was to sort through the mail. And I just found a web design program at one of the colleges. And I was like, well, I'm not really doing much now. And I had some money that I had saved for a car. So I was like, the car can wait. I like this computer stuff. I remember playing around with the website stuff in that one class. And I'm like, I don't know, this seems like it would be fun. Let me just try it. And so it was a certificate program. It was like 14 weeks long. I thought, you know what, this isn't like another 2 to 4 years of my life. Let me just try it. And that was pretty much it. That's how I got into it.
Was there something about that class that you took in school?
I think I was sort of always just kind of interested in technology in general. And then I was also interested in art. So I think when I did that one class and made that website, I was like, oh, I'm basically drawing in a browser. And so it kind of combined my love of art, but into something that actually seemed like it could be a job. And so I think I think that's why I sort of gravitated to front end as well, because I liked the visual aspect.
So how did you get from that point of getting like your first, you went to school then for a more focused degree. How do you get to that and to having so many opportunities to like teach others?
After I graduated from the program, I kind of had a pretty linear developer path where the first job I had, I didn't get to do as much coding. We used a CMS at that job. So I was there for a bit, and that was more of just kind of learning how to work in an organization. And then after I left that, I became like a junior developer, intermediate, senior, and then I became like the tech lead for front-end development at my last full-time job. And so that was kind of a pretty straight path from the beginning to senior. But then along the way, there was some buzz around the group Ladies Learning Code was getting started in Toronto. And someone at the organization reached out to me and said, hey, if you're interested, maybe you can come speak at a workshop or something. And I thought, why not? Because I had noticed that even in my developer jobs, I had sort of become like the liaison between the technical folks and the non-technical folks. Like, a PM would come to me, like a project manager, and say, oh, the client is asking for this. How do I explain to them why we can't add this feature or why it takes so long? And I would sort of like help them write the email in a way that explains the technical reasons, but like to someone who's not technical. Or sometimes we would have like the designers or even the project managers kind of help out with like content management. And so I would just show them how to do basic like paragraph tags or adding a link or something, just so that they can kind of like help us with content. And then people would always be like, oh, wow, you make this so easy to understand, or like, you're so good at explaining things. And so I think I kind of kept hearing that, and it just made me feel like, oh, maybe I have like a natural kind of knack for explaining things or teaching. When they reached out to me at Ladies Learning Code to come to a workshop, I'm like, let me just check this out. And then I met some people there. We kept in touch. And then a friend of mine, Pearl Chen, she was leading the first workshop. And after we connected there, she got asked me to do another workshop with her. And it just kind of like spiraled from there. And so I ended up getting involved with that organization and eventually working there full time. And that's when I created the curriculum and all that sort of stuff. And by then I had also started teaching at a college here in Toronto as well, Humber College. And so it just kind of naturally gravitated towards that from just sort of explaining stuff to people at work to like dipping my toes into teaching a workshop, and then it just kind of escalated from there.
Well, that's so interesting, and I think that I kind of skipped over this in your intro, that you actually have agency experience, and I know that can be like a really challenging job, but it's also a really good way of sort of diving in because you tend to like work on a lot of different things.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about like that development of getting to like understand all the things.
Well, the great thing about working at agencies is you end up working with a bunch of different clients. When you learn stuff, you kind of learn the general overview of how certain things work. When you are put on a project and you have to do more specific things, then you're forced to learn things that you didn't know already to make it work, if that makes any sense. Like CSS preprocess was a pretty new thing when I was in my agency job. So it was like, oh, we need to find a way where multiple people can work on this at the same time, but then the code looks consistent, but then we want it to be efficient. So then it kind of like forced us to like, oh, let's try these new tools and let's try to find new ways of working on things. That is what I think I really took away from working at these different agencies, is just learning how to work with other people on your team and just the business side of it, I guess, as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think that maybe a couple of things that people miss when they're in school is that opportunity to work for a client. I think that that's lacking. And I really like what you said about how people were saying that you really understood how to explain things or how to do things like that seemed natural to you. I wonder if for you, since you were, psychology major, if you think that somehow had effect into how you went about like explaining and also maybe talking to clients.
I definitely think so. At first, it seemed weird. Like, how did I end up in this field when this is what I studied? But I think even just the experience of just university in general, like in university, most of the stuff that you learn is much more theoretical rather than hands-on. So you have to learn how to, express yourself better because you're doing more reading, you're doing more writing. But not only that, you have to analyze and you have to critically think about it. And we would do a lot more like long form reading and stuff. So I think it does make sense in terms of how it has affected my teaching, especially doing psychology and communication. So like now I have to think about how do I, explain a concept without being condescending, for example. How do I...
it's a good lesson.
Or like, because since most of the stuff that I teach is mostly beginner, I need to find a way to explain it without acting like, shouldn't you know this already? Or being like too beginner, like I'm talking to a child or something.
Yeah, a common problem in developers, like, sometimes they know too much. And I think that they forget what it was like not to know something.
Right.
And when you're explaining, I've been to so many talks where you can tell the person like wrote the code, but they forgot what it was like not to know something. And also what the right, understanding like your audience, what the right level for this audience. Like sometimes you can go faster because the audience is at a different level. But that I think is really important. So what would you suggest people do today? Like having had, we both had like the college experience and, you've done a lot of other things in addition to that. You've done boot camps, you've done curricula for different places. So how do you think people should approach learning in general? Should they get a degree, self-teach? What do you think they should do?
This is always a hard question because I really think it depends on two things. So it depends on your personality, your learning style, and even something as simple as like your age, right? Like I can't imagine being fresh out of high school and then taking like, a 9 to 14 week boot camp and then just going straight to work. Like to me, I couldn't imagine like 18, 19, even 20-year-old myself just going straight into the workforce like that. That experience of critically thinking, writing essays, learning how to express ourselves, like a lot of that for me came through university, my university classes. So, but at the same time, I always say like school will always be there. So let's say you decide to take a university program. If you drop out in a year or two and then you end up in a boot camp, there's nothing wrong with that either, right? And I think the second part too is it really depends on the instructors and the quality of the instructors. isn't really based on whether it's a boot camp or certificate program or a degree program. I mean, that's just going to vary. So the best way is to try to do as much research as possible. Like I always try to say, read reviews or even try to reach out to students who have taken those programs. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a thing that LinkedIn is good for, is seeing, you can search, like say there's a particular boot camp you're interested in. You can search that boot camp name, and then you can kind of see who has added that to their LinkedIn profile, for example. So then you can kind of reach out to them and say, hey, what was your experience here? And just doing like informational interviews as much as you can. Or if you can see what instructors are in these programs, maybe you can look them up and just kind of see, if they've done YouTube videos or interviews like this, or, conference talks, and you can kind of get a feel for what the instructors are like. So that's the part that's always hard, is you kind of don't know until you get there.
Yeah, I think that I've had some experiences in that. Like when I first went to school, I don't think I was as good a student because I didn't realize that you could drop a class if you didn't think the teacher and you mesh correctly. Like that thought did not enter into my mind. And I remember I went back to school for my master's, and I remember that I signed up for a class, and the first day I was like, I got to drop this class. This person is not the right sort of teacher. And so I'm just going to do poorly. And at that point, I was really concerned about doing well. I'm like, this time I'm going to do extremely well. And, but a lot of the things that you said, like, for example, school was a great place to sort of understand like that process of like learning, distilling, communicating, some of the classes that I didn't think were going to be important, like a lot of the writing, for example, or even the public speaking. Like who cares about public speaking? It's, just an easy A. And then you're like, I got to present something in front of my boss. Like those things are actually a lot more useful than you think. And I think especially if you're trying to do well, you're going to be having to manage so many things at the same time. Maybe you're taking 3 classes, there's like homework schedules. And then on top of that, maybe if you've got a job, it teaches you, especially I think from like high school, that there's an aspect of organization that needs to be involved. But then again, like maybe if you're a little bit older and you've already been through school, something like a short bootcamp program, you've got the time, you've got a little bit more money, you can set aside like a lot of focus time. Or perhaps like if you're a self-learner, that is good. You watch stuff and you just go try it. That's another approach. And I think you have to do an assessment of, what do you need right now and how do you learn best? And then, go do that. So tell me a little bit about, you've created so many different types of curricula that I'm wondering, how do you decide what to add and what to skip? Like it seems like everybody wants the latest and greatest of everything, but then it's like old 6 months from now. So it didn't even matter that you learn like, everybody learn Angular. And then it's like, forget about jQuery and it's Bootstrap. And it's like, now the new frameworks are like Solid.js and React. And, how do you decide what to put in something like that?
Yeah, that's always hard. And I think that's probably why I primarily focus on foundational languages. So even with all these newfangled tools, HTML and CSS is pretty much the same. Like there'll be new features into the language, but in itself, it doesn't really change that much. But I mean, you can't not use any sort of tools. Like say, for example, I've used Google Fonts in my CSS Essential training courses. And I swear that website, the UI, updates every 6 months. So there's always people in the comments that are like, it doesn't look like that anymore. And so I think now what I try to do, if I'm using any sort of tool or framework and stuff, what I try to focus on is how does it work in general? Like, let's go back to the Google Fonts example. Basically, you pick a font, you put it in your little folder, and then you copy the code, right? And so I'm trying to reword it now to say, the UI will change quite often, so it might not look like this in 6 months. But just remember, the basics is you pick a font, blah, blah, blah. And I sort of just try to keep it high level in terms of how it works, and then also make it really clear that you have to be comfortable with change a lot in development. Your favorite tools are going to come and go. Languages are going to change. Websites are going to change. So I just try to kind of instill that you're always going to be learning. Things are always going to be changing. And that's just normal and how it is.
Yeah. And, one of the reasons I started this toolbox sort of concept was, and I mentioned it a lot of times at the beginning of my intros for them. I always say the pace of the web is relentless. You don't necessarily need to know the difference between like React and Solid.js and Angular and whatever. What you need to know is what makes this technology relevant, and is it something that you need to pursue because it is going to change and shorten the time to get to your result, a lot quicker. It's a lot of things have done that in the industry, like, React did that, Angular did that, and other frameworks like, Svelte is doing some of that, Astro is doing some of that. It's not important that you understand necessarily everything there is to know about that technology, but I think what those technologies have brought, like the virtual DOM, for example, was something that really destroy jQuery. Like everybody used to use jQuery, but then in a world where the DOM is managed for you, then you don't really need jQuery anymore. You're like, what? It's no longer going to get you there quicker. And so I think that that's the important thing. Like, understand what is important about this technology. And at some point, you are going to have to continuously learn, like you said. So what technologies or skills, and I'm not talking about technical things necessarily, do you think people need to know to be successful today? I think you probably touched on some of them with when people were saying you're so good at, at explaining things and getting along with people. I mean, what sort of things do you recommend that people know that to do well?
Right. I think that soft skills is so underrated. You kind of know what, in general, what technical skills that you need. Yeah. But I think things that people don't understand is, or they need to understand if they want to be a web developer or be in the tech industry, is what I was saying before. There's constant change. So you have to learn how to be uncomfortable. Imposter syndrome is usually more of like when you are accomplished, you have accomplished something that you don't feel like you're good enough. But if you just are uncomfortable with doing something new, that's fine. And you have to learn how to be uncomfortable. You have to learn how to say, you know what, I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to figure it out, or I'm going to try it. And so, I hear a lot of students say like, one day I'll never have to Google anything again. And you know what, that day is never going to come.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah.
You don't know how to do, right? So you have to learn how to be uncomfortable. You have to be very patient. You have to be very detail-oriented, because there's always sort of these little things that you have to do that can be just annoying to someone who hates, like, granular details. Like, can you imagine, like, sometimes I'll have to rename, like, 10 files, for example. Like, it's such a small thing that has nothing to do with technical stuff, but then I'll have to, rename it as something thumbnail, something thumbnail, because you want all your files to be organized and stuff. And so you have to just be patient and just know that there's a lot of mundane activities and stuff you have to do, and you kind of have to enjoy that a little bit. Like,
I wonder when you show people like Stack Overflow, do you wait until like the last day of school and then you tell them like this is what everybody actually uses?
I'm pretty sure I tell them pretty early on.
That's good.
That's something that I usually teach too, is how to find answers, because that's the other thing too, is, you can have friends that you can talk to, you can join groups and stuff, but a lot of times at the end of the day, we have to figure out a lot of the stuff by ourselves. And so one of the most important things to learn is how to find answers, how to search for things. I remember in one of my last newsletters, I actually talked about that. I showed some examples of like, how do I do X in CSS? And I was saying, if you put the language in your search results, that'll help. Or just little things like that. Or Stack Overflow, for example, too. It's always so frustrating when you find the question, but you can't find the answer.
When I used to teach like a class on HTML to beginners, as soon as I would say, listen, this book is already out of date. So it's better for you to learn where to find the answers online. And something like CSS, for example, just changes. Even to this day, we're having new features being added all the time. So don't worry that you are never going to know everything, and nobody else does. Even the smartest people in the world, they like Google everything, they Stack Overflow everything. And I think as long as you make sort of like a welcoming, environment where people can feel safe to ask questions, understanding that even the seniors are constantly looking things up. I think it's funny when I have to look up and something up in one of my old courses because I forgot how to do something in Bootstrap. It's ridiculous. Yeah. And even I do that.
I was just about to say that. There's been many times where I'll go and Google something and then I pop up.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great feeling. So you did a course on freelancing, or you did kind of like a segment on getting your first job as a web developer course, which is really good. So you have this chapter on freelancing. When do you recommend that somebody, a developer, a designer, look at that as an option?
Me personally, I would wait until you get some work experience, at an organization, because I think you need that experience of just kind of knowing how to work with people in general. But then, especially if you're just learning, it's really helpful to just learn from other developers who are more senior than you. And so I would say, if it was me personally, actually, I think I waited about 10 years to finally go fully freelance. But I would say even just a couple of years. But I would always say, take on a couple jobs here and there, even while you're working. Because when you quit your job, you don't want to quit with absolutely nothing. So maybe when you decide it's time for you to move on and become freelance full time, you've actually had a couple clients already, or maybe you have a couple lined up to the point where, now maybe you have too many clients and you can't juggle your full-time job and freelancing. There's always a big discussion of how younger people are less loyal to their companies and stuff these days. But I always feel like you should always have a plan B. So even if you love your job, do a little freelance just so that you have some other experience on the side. Even if maybe you hadn't planned to go freelance full time, you have this little bit of extra experience that you can build off of if you want to. I mean, I think there are people who go freelance right away. And again, maybe that's a personality thing too. But again, me personally, I think having some experience and also being able to maybe save up a little bit of money with your regular paychecks, that probably helps too. I always say you should have an F-it fund. Yeah, right. So even if you love your job, everything's going great, put a little bit aside every month just in case maybe something happens one day, or maybe things just change and you get to the point where you're I'm ready to leave. But if you don't have that little nest egg, you can't leave, and now you're kind of stuck, and maybe when you start to feel down, that's going to make it harder for you to find a new job or find new clients or to network and stuff. So I would say a little bit of at least a couple years of experience and a little bit of savings to cushion you while you're trying to find new work.
That's super good advice. I know I've done, to this day, I have a freelance client that I picked up eons ago that I just never dropped because it's, great work, and it doesn't take an insane amount of time. So one of the other courses that I love is working with Git, where you covered the GUI. Is there a time where you actually go for the GUI instead of the terminal?
I think it kind of goes back to me just being more of a visual person. So say, for example, if I'm branching, for example, I like actually seeing how it's branched and stuff.
I know.
It's just represented a little bit more visually. I do like using terminal for sort of basic things like cloning a repo or even pushing, polling, things where I don't really need to see anything. But again, if I'm branching or if I just want to compare the differences. What did I add? What did I remove? And then it's just all visualized a little bit better for me.
I've seen a couple of super advanced things that you can do with that GUI. You can do a line commit where you're committing a single piece of something. And this is why I always go to try to use it. But then I'm I'm just going to go back to that terminal.
Remember way back in the day when people were using Dreamweaver and people would have opinions about WYSIWYG editors. You could
I remember that, yes.
Kind of like that, where it's Well, I could do the git commands, or as you were mentioning, if you wanted to just commit like a piece of a file, for example, right? So when you're using a GUI, you can basically just say, I can't remember what the actual button or whatever, but you can basically just click off the things that you don't want to add, and you just put add.
That's crazy. Yeah. See, that's where I think it beats it. Like in the individual, like the very specific commits, I think it will be so superior. And it's like every now and then I'm just going to go for the GUI now. So you also did a course on CSS Design Systems and Architectures, which I thought was awesome. Like, when do you think it's a good time to reach into something like that? And do you introduce that, in school, like in the curricula that you do, or do you think that's something like more advanced for after people have kind of learned the basics?
I think it should be introduced early, actually, because when you think about design systems, it's more about writing thoughtful CSS, because now you're thinking about how to actually organize it. So I definitely think, you want to teach sort of the basics and stuff at first, because you don't want to throw too many new things at beginners. And I also feel like you have to understand the pain points before you can fix it. So you have to work with a CSS file that's a mess before you can think of like, how can I organize this so that it makes sense? Or like if someone else is coming in, we can both write together, or I can just leave it as is and someone else can pick up where I left off. And so it doesn't really make sense unless you've had to deal with the flip side of that, which is like, everything's all over the place. Even the formatting is off. There's, duplicate code and stuff. And so you kind of have to understand what you're fixing before you fix it. But I definitely think it should be introduced early, because then it'll help build good habits earlier on.
It definitely saves you when you're building very large things to have like an organizational concept and methods, and it's not, maybe people who are just building smaller websites, it's not as important, but it definitely saves your life whenever it's something way complicated. So, all right, it's time to get into the very controversial stuff. So what's your opinion about some of these new utility first frameworks like Tailwind CSS?
Okay, so I've always maintained the same opinion of it. And so I always say that tools and frameworks should be there to help you, but it shouldn't be a crutch for missing knowledge. So it makes sense that I think you said something earlier, like something like a quicker way to get to the end or something like that. We were talking about something else. So I think that if you are using something like Tailwind, because you're just like, I just want to get this up and done quickly, it makes sense. But if I've definitely had people in my course, in my CSS Essential Training course, will say something like, why don't you just use Bootstrap? And the thing is, you cannot replace a framework with the foundational knowledge. And so I think you need to understand that first before you can use the tool. Because then, let's say you're using Tailwind or Bootstrap, and then something doesn't work. You don't know how to fix it. Or something doesn't, you want to maybe customize it a little bit more. But then you don't know, because all you've been doing is copying and pasting snippets. But if you already have you don't even have to be an expert, but at least as long as you understand the foundation of how it works, and you're like, I just don't want to spend all this time writing all this code when all these badges are already created for me, all these grids are already created for me. That's fine. But if you are saying, why do I need to learn CSS when I can just use one of these frameworks? That's going to be a problem, I think.
Yeah, I think Tailwind itself is controversial, but I think your concept is solid. Back in the way old days where we were editing the templates like directly, the entire site would go down because somebody forgot to close like a tag, because they would be editing like the HTML. Just imagine like the homepage of like a website just going down because somebody forgot to close something. Yeah, you have to understand the basics, but then maybe something like Bootstrap on a smaller project can help you get there quicker. And then if you're using like maybe component-based architectures, then something like Tailwind makes more sense. I'm like afraid of the people that just go like straight into React without knowing JavaScript. It's crazy.
Yeah, so, like that's wild to me.
So what about the backend? Like, we talk about these days of front end and back end developer and full stack developer. I mean, do you think there's even such a thing as a pure like front end? How much do front end developers need to know these days about some of the other things?
I think it depends on what you focus on too. So, if you are a React developer using these other JavaScript frameworks, I mean, technically it's front end because it's JavaScript based, but it mimics a lot of stuff we used to rely on back end for. So I think that if you really like hone in on sort of like the JavaScript libraries, maybe you don't really need to know that much back end because you're kind of already supplementing that with these libraries. But if you were to do something like maybe you develop Shopify themes, for example, right? The Shopify themes are written in Liquid, which are Ruby based. And so you could be a front-end developer who does Shopify themes, but you're going to have to understand a little bit about how Ruby works and the structures and stuff at least. You don't have to be a full-on Ruby developer, but at least know how to tweak it and stuff if you are, or not even if you are a template developer, but even if, you're just setting up Shopify sites for your clients or something, and your client says, oh, I want to add X feature that's not in the theme, then you can go in there and kind of tweak a little bit, but you'll need to understand it.
I think you have to think about it also in terms of value. Connecting to things is going to be a core sort of skill that you need to develop in some way. So understanding like SQL or, NoSQL database. But if you can also be just as well a super strong designer, you should be doing more design because that's really what you're gifted at. A lot of developers, they don't even like making stuff look good. They just want it to work well. And so you have to find your place, but then attempt to be a little flexible.
I think you brought up a good point. I mean, the conversation is always like, should front-end developers know back-end? Should back-end developers know front-end? But we don't really talk enough about, like, should developers understand maybe design a little bit? Because
they should.
With me being sort of just like more of a visual person, I applied that to when I was working as a developer. So a lot of times, the designers would love me because I would make it look exactly like the mock-up. Whereas maybe there's a reason why they chose 12 pixels of space rather than 10 or whatever, right? And so for them, they can see that difference. But if you are a person who's just like, oh, it works, and you don't really care about what it looks like, you're going to give it like 15 pixels padding and think it's fine. And the designer's like, no, it needs to be 10, right? And so I think there is definitely value in developers understanding some basics in design as well, or at least, try to make it look like the thing that was given to you.
And what's so funny is that developers and designers both are apologetic about each other's jobs. Like I know some fantastic, like super talented developers, and they're always like, forgive my poor design skills. And I'm like, listen, don't worry. Like you're getting it. Your value is in understanding your part. And if you recognize that somebody else can do this other part, they're equally as valuable in putting something that's great together. So let's talk about some of the we talked about how CSS changes all the time. This really annoys me because I'm always like doing a course and something happens, like I'm recording and they change something and I'm like, are you kidding me? So what are you excited about some of these upcoming features of CSS?
I think anything that I consider new isn't even that new anymore. It's just, it wasn't there when I got started. Like say, for example, I just recently did like a short YouTube video on how to use CSS variables, which isn't really that new. I think it's been maybe 6-7 years or something that it was first introduced, but it was new to me because I've always used Sass to sort of extend those features. And so I was like, let me look into this because I've seen people use it and I'm like, hey, this is actually pretty cool. And when I did the short video, there was some people who were like, this is great. I'm going to start using this right away. So I'm kind of, I guess, excited to see these more like features that we had to use things like Sass to extend. Like it would be nice if the actual CSS language did that. So to me, I think like adding the CSS variables is kind of a start to seeing it. I don't want it to become totally like a programming language because that's what I like about CSS, but I do want to see some more of those kinds of features like, nesting, the declaration blocks, and like I said, variables, and just finding ways to sort of make things more reusable and extendable for CSS.
Yeah.
And also just kind of using like grid and Flexbox more. Like it's new to me just because it's anything that's like less than 10 years old is new to me.
It's really amazing that you mentioned Sass because I am a firm believer in that. Sass was so awesome. It's been around for 15 years. I was looking at some surveys about user satisfaction, and it's extremely high for Sass. So I'm not sure that CSS variables are ever going to be the same.
Yeah. I'm definitely not ready to give up Sass, and I've definitely seen the discussion of people saying, we don't need this anymore, but I'm like, it's just variables. There's still a whole bunch of things that's still missing, though. But I like where it's going. I think there's kind of like the possibilities of what will be added next.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool, exciting things like layers and stuff are pretty interesting. They are looking to install like a parent selector. And you mentioned a grid and Flexbox. So what are your thoughts between like grid and Flexbox? When should somebody use one over the other?
Well, the main distinction that I usually think about when I decide which one I want to use is Flexbox basically works in one direction. So either you lay out things in rows or you lay things out in columns. So let's say I'm just doing like a basic layout where I have the content in the middle and maybe there's a left sidebar that has like the menu stuff and then maybe the right sidebar has, extra information. Flexbox would be great for that because you're basically just making like 3 columns and maybe you have a header and a footer. So something very basic. But grid, you can align things on rows and columns. So that's more if you want a more complex layout. So if you want, remember how we used to actually make grid layouts with CSS floating and stuff, right? And when we would do those 12-column layouts and stuff.
Heck! So I used to do table layout, so I am like a dinosaur.
Oh. So the table layouts, the 12-column layouts. So if you feel the need. And I guess this might make more sense for people who, have developed that, had written CSS in the past. But if you feel like you need that 12-column layout sort of idea, then grid would probably work best. But generally, I think for me personally, I always try to do it in Flexbox first because it's a little more simple. And if I find that I'm like, oh, I can't get this to be where I want it to be, then I'll try to switch over to grid.
That's a good point. And I think that sometimes too, like, grid is better for some things, and I think that's the key. Like, you have to know when things are better, and that's when you should use them. Because I feel like if it's not broke, then I don't want to spend a bunch of time trying to get my slide ruler out and figuring out when I have to like grid something else, and like having all the how you have to like write all the exceptions to like, okay, what if somebody doesn't have this feature, and it drives me crazy. So cool. Also, tell me, how can somebody find you? What sort of, you mentioned a lot of different things. You said a YouTube channel, you have a newsletter. So how can people find you today?
The easiest way is probably just ChristinaTruong.com because at least I have links to these various things on there. Or you can just look me up on YouTube, Decoded by Christina.
That's great. Yeah. And they're obviously LinkedIn, of course. I mean, that's usually where I find a lot of people. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I love these conversations. You learn so much. And I don't know, maybe one day we'll go like in a 3-way battle with Morton to see and talk about Flexbox and grid and see how that works.
Yep.